In January 1997, 12-year-old Rosalynn McGinnis walked out of her middle school in Poteau, Oklahoma, and vanished. Her stepfather pulled her into a van, and for the next 19 years, across dozens of locations in 2 countries, she was never found. Her missing persons flyer existed on the internet the entire time. But then one day in 2016, 2 ordinary people at a grocery store in rural Mexico saw what law enforcement across 2 nations had missed for nearly 2 decades. And what they discovered shocked everyone in a way no one could have imagined. Before we dive deeper into this story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you like videos like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It was January 1997. The Spice Girls were at the top of every radio chart. Bill Clinton was being sworn in for his 2nd term as president. The Dallas Cowboys had just won their 3rd Super Bowl in 4 years, and in small-town America, life felt, at least on the surface, uncomplicated and safe. Poteau, Oklahoma sits in the eastern foothills of the Ouachita Mountains, a town of roughly 8,000 people nestled in a valley so green it almost doesn't look like Oklahoma. It is the kind of place where children ride bikes until the streetlights come on, where teachers know students by their parents' names, and where the idea of something terrible happening to one of your own children feels like something that only existed on the evening news, somewhere else to someone else. Rosalynn Michelle McGinnis was 12 years old, with dark hair and a quiet resilience that people who knew her still remember. She lived in Poteau with her mother, who had been in a difficult relationship with a man named Henri Piette, a transient, controlling figure who had inserted himself into the family's life in the years before 1997. Rosalynn was in middle school. She was, by every account, a normal 12-year-old girl walking through an ordinary Tuesday. On a weekday afternoon, Rosalynn McGinnis walked out of her middle school in Poteau, Oklahoma, just as she had done hundreds of times before. It was the end of the school day. Other students were streaming out around her. The parking lot was loud with buses and parents and the ordinary chaos of dismissal. Henri Piette was waiting. He was in his early 40s, and he knew exactly where Rosalynn would be and exactly when she would appear. He had been in a relationship with her mother. He knew the school. He knew the routine. The moment Rosalynn stepped away from the main crowd, Piette pulled her into a van. What the confirmed record shows is that it was over in seconds, before anyone understood what they were seeing. What happened immediately after is not fully documented in the named public record. No witness account has been confirmed in official sources as having produced a usable lead that day. What is confirmed is this. Within hours, Rosalynn McGinnis was gone from Poteau, Oklahoma. Piette dyed her hair, placed fake glasses on her face, and told her she would no longer answer to the name Rosalynn McGinnis. Her mother reached out to the media. Child Search Ministries circulated a missing persons flyer, her photo, her age, the date she disappeared, and a note that she may be in the company of her non-custodial stepfather, Henri Piette. The flyer went out. The phones rang. And then, slowly, the trail went cold. The Poteau Police Department opened a missing persons case for Rosalynn McGinnis in January 1997. They had a name for the man suspected of taking her, Henri Piette. They had a physical description. They had a relationship to the family. Child Search Ministries circulated a flyer with Rosalynn's photograph, her age, the exact date she disappeared, and the name of the man she may have been taken by. The flyer went out across Oklahoma. And then the investigation, in any documented public sense, went silent. No named detective appears in the public record as having worked this case through the late 1990s. No confirmed tip led authorities to Rosalynn McGinnis. The one man who could have led them to her was already gone. The FBI has jurisdiction over interstate kidnapping cases. When a child is taken across state lines, federal resources are supposed to follow. What the confirmed record shows is that Piette did cross state lines, repeatedly for years with Rosalynn and eventually their children in tow. He moved them dozens of times within the United States before crossing into Mexico. There is no confirmed public record of a sustained federal pursuit during those years. No named federal agent appears in the documented record as having actively tracked Piette between 1997 and 2016. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had Rosalynn's case in their system. Her missing persons poster remained searchable on the internet. And still, for 19 years, no agency found her. By the mid-2000s, Rosalynn McGinnis had already given birth to multiple children in captivity. She was living in rural Mexico in tents and temporary structures, with a man who had forced her to abandon her name, her appearance, and her identity. Her missing persons flyer, the one her mother had helped create in 1997, was still indexed on the internet, findable by anyone with a search engine and her name. Every year that passed without a confirmed investigative development was another year the one tool that would eventually save her sat and used. No authority in any confirmed public record searched the right geography. No agency in any documented account pursued Piette into Mexico during those 19 years. The specific detail missing from every search was deceptively simple. No one appears to have looked south of the border. Rosalynn McGinnis had been living within driving distance of a U.S. consulate the entire time. It was an ordinary couple at a grocery store, not a task force, not a federal agent, not a tip line, who finally typed her name into a search engine and found what nearly 2 decades of institutional silence had buried. Henri Piette was in his early 40s when he pulled Rosalynn McGinnis into a van outside her middle school in January 1997. He was not a stranger to her family. He had been in a romantic relationship with her mother, living in and around the family's orbit in eastern Oklahoma in the years before the kidnapping. He knew the school. He knew the schedule. He knew the child. What the confirmed record establishes, through the Wagoner County District Attorney's Office and through evidence presented at both his federal and state trials, is that the abuse did not begin with the kidnapping. Piette had begun sexually abusing Rosalynn when she was approximately 10 or 11 years old, inside Wagoner County, Oklahoma, before he ever put her in that van. The kidnapping was not an impulsive act. It was a calculated escalation. A man who had already committed serious crimes against a child, removing that child from the jurisdiction where those crimes could be prosecuted. No prior criminal conviction for Piette appears in the confirmed public record. There is no documented prior prison sentence, no named prior victim in official sources, no confirmed prior case that authorities failed to act on. The honest version of his background is this. He was not a man the system had already processed and released. He was a man the system had not yet caught. And the crimes he had already committed against Rosalynn, the molestation inside Wagoner County that the state would not prosecute him for until 2024, were crimes that disappeared the moment he took her across the county line. What is confirmed is the pattern. Piette used to stay invisible for 19 years. He adopted multiple identities, for himself and for Rosalynn. He kept the family transient, moving dozens of times across the United States and eventually into rural Mexico, never staying long enough to be found. He isolated Rosalynn completely, ensuring she had no contact with the outside world that he did not control. He threatened violence, against her and against their children. He built a closed world with no exits. And for 19 years it worked. Not because the system was close and missed. Because in any confirmed, documented sense, the system was never close at all. There was no compound. There was no fixed address. That was the point. Henri Piette never allowed Rosalynn McGinnis to exist in one place long enough to be found. The confirmed record establishes that across 19 years, Piette moved Rosalynn and eventually their children dozens of times. Across Oklahoma, across multiple American states, and finally deep into rural Mexico. The homes were not homes. Court documents and McGinnis's own testimony confirmed that the family lived in tents in remote areas of Mexico, far from urban centers, far from neighbors, far from anyone who might ask a question Piette could not control. There was no stable electricity. There was no consistent running water. When Rosalynn required medical attention, including, according to her own account, a surgery to remove her gallbladder performed under primitive conditions, she was given no recovery time. She was ordered back to work before she had healed. Her children were not enrolled in school. The outside world, in any meaningful sense, did not exist for Rosalynn McGinnis for 19 years. The system Piette used to maintain control was built on 4 pillars: isolation, manufactured identity, economic helplessness, and the constant threat of violence. From the moment he put Rosalynn in that van in January 1997, he began dismantling her. He dyed her hair. He gave her fake glasses. He changed her name multiple times over the years, so that even she existed in the outside world as a fiction. He did the same for himself, cycling through aliases that made him untraceable. He kept the family in poverty and in motion, ensuring that Rosalynn had no money, no documents, no language fluency in remote Mexican communities, and no established relationship with anyone he had not approved. He told their children, according to McGinnis's own testimony, that the only reason they were alive was because their mother was present, that without her, he would kill them. He used the children as leverage against their own mother. Piette, in his own statements during trial proceedings, did not describe what he did as captivity. He called Rosalynn his wife. He claimed they were married. He told a television station that 99% of the allegations against him were false. This was not the language of a man who believed he had committed crimes. It was the language of a man who had spent 19 years constructing a reality in which what he was doing was normal, and forcing an isolated 12-year-old girl to live inside that constructed reality until she could no longer clearly see the edges of it. In her interview with the Dr. Oz show in 2019, McGinnis described the weight of keeping the truth from her own children. "They didn't know," she said. "I kept the truth from them until I escaped from Mexico. The reason I didn't tell them, of course, was because what I knew inside was how much it's damaged me. I didn't want them to grow up knowing that." This was a woman who, even inside captivity, was trying to protect her children from the knowledge of what had been done to her. That is the depth of psychological damage Piette had inflicted, and the depth of Rosalynn's endurance inside it. Rosalynn McGinnis gave birth to her first child in the year 2000. She was 15 years old. Over the years that followed, she gave birth to 8 more. The children were, simultaneously, the heaviest burden of her captivity and the only reason she did not break entirely. They gave her something to protect. They gave her a reason to stay alive and functional inside conditions designed to destroy both. But they also made escape feel impossible for years. Where does a woman with 9 children, no money, no documents, no phone, and no confirmed allies go when she lives in a tent in rural Mexico? How does she move that many people without Piette knowing? How does she protect them from a man who has told them, to their faces, that he will kill them if she is not there? McGinnis later told KTUL that she had considered escape for years before she was finally able to act. What changed was not a single dramatic moment but a slow accumulation. The gallbladder surgery she was denied recovery from, the violence that never stopped, and the quiet, growing recognition that if she did not get her children out, they would spend their entire lives inside the world Piette had built. She did not escape because she stopped being afraid. She escaped because she became more afraid of what staying would do to her children than of what leaving might do to her. For the first years after January 1997, the Poteau Police Department held an open missing persons case for Rosalynn McGinnis. They had her photograph. They had Henri Piette's name. They had the note on the flyer that she may be in the company of her non-custodial stepfather. What they did not have, in any confirmed documented record, was a sustained active investigation. No named detective from the Poteau Police Department appears in the public record as having pursued Piette across state lines in 1997 or 1998. Rosalynn and her captor were moving through American states, Oklahoma and others, separated from the investigators who held her file by nothing more than the absence of anyone looking in the right direction. The Poteau Police Department eventually went quiet on the case. The file stayed open. The trail did not. The FBI carries federal jurisdiction over interstate kidnapping. When Henri Piette crossed the Oklahoma state line with a 12-year-old girl in January 1997, the case became a federal matter. The confirmed record establishes that Piette moved Rosalynn across multiple American states over the years that followed. There is no confirmed public record of a sustained FBI pursuit during that period. No named federal agent appears in documented sources as having actively tracked Piette through his American movements in the late 1990s or early 2000s. Rosalynn McGinnis and her captor were living on American soil in American towns for years after the kidnapping. The FBI had her name, his name, and the federal mandate to find them. In any confirmed, documented sense, they never came close. By the time Piette moved the family permanently into rural Mexico, Rosalynn had already been in captivity for years. She had already given birth to children. She was living in tents in remote areas, far from any official American presence. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had her case in their system. Her missing persons flyer, created in 1997 by Child Search Ministries at her mother's request, was still indexed and searchable on the public internet. Any person, anywhere in the world with an internet connection, could have typed her name and found her photograph. No authority in any confirmed public record did this during the 19 years she was missing. Not one documented investigative action in the public record placed an official within reaching distance of Rosalynn McGinnis between January 1997 and July 2016. 1 year before her escape, 2 ordinary people at a grocery store in rural Mexico would discover what nearly 2 decades of institutional silence had failed to find. Not with a federal warrant. Not with advanced forensic technology. Not with an interstate task force or a cross-border intelligence operation, but with something none of the previous efforts had used. One of them simply listened to what Rosalynn McGinnis was trying to tell her, and then she went home and typed a name into a search engine. Rosalynn McGinnis had been missing for 19 years and approximately 6 months when she walked through the gates of the U.S. consulate in Nogales, Mexico in July 2016. She was repatriated to the United States with 8 of her children and resettled in the Kansas City, Missouri area, where confirmed reporting from KSHB places her in the years following her escape. The confirmed public record does not detail the precise moment her mother learned she was alive, or the exact location where that call was received. What it does confirm is that the family was reunited, that the woman who had circulated missing persons flyers in 1997 and the daughter who had been forbidden to speak her own name for 19 years found their way back to each other. Rosalynn's cousin, identified in KSHB reporting only as Archuleta, spoke publicly about what the disappearance had meant to the family. She remembered the search. She remembered, specifically, the stacks of flyers. What she could not have known in 1997, what none of them could have known, was that Rosalynn had spent those 19 years approximately 1,500 miles from Poteau, Oklahoma, in a country that shared a border with the one where every search had been conducted. She had never been on another continent. She had never been unreachable. She had been in Mexico, and the only thing that had ever stood between Rosalynn McGinnis and home was the absence of anyone looking in the right direction. Henri Piette was arrested in Mexico in October 2017 and returned to Oklahoma, where he had been charged the previous month with first-degree rape and other offenses. He was then indicted on federal charges. A federal grand jury indicted Piette in December 2017 for kidnapping Rosalynn McGinnis in 1997 when she was approximately 11 years old, and for traveling with the intent to engage in sexual acts with a juvenile. He was also charged in Wagoner County State Court with first-degree rape of a victim under age 14, child abuse by injury, and 2 counts of lewd molestation, charges stemming from the abuse he had committed against McGinnis inside Oklahoma before the kidnapping. Piette entered no guilty plea to any charge. He denied everything. He told a Fox 23 News camera outside a courtroom, surrounded by deputies, that 99% of the allegations against him were lies. He told another outlet that he had never raped anyone. He maintained throughout the proceedings that Rosalynn McGinnis was his wife, that their union was legitimate, and that what the prosecution was calling crimes were, in his framing, a marriage. The federal proceedings moved through 2018 and into 2019, with the trial finally commencing in the Eastern District of Oklahoma. It lasted 7 days. The verdict was reached on June 6, 2019. The federal jury found Henri Piette guilty on both counts, kidnapping and traveling with intent to engage in a sexual act with a juvenile. Rosalynn McGinnis testified at that trial. She sat in a federal courtroom and told a jury what Henri Piette had done to her for 19 years. She did it under oath. She did it with her name attached. And the jury believed her. The state charges in Wagoner County, the ones for crimes committed before the kidnapping when McGinnis was 11 years old, took far longer to reach trial. Piette was not tried on those charges until October 2024, when a Wagoner County jury found him guilty of lewd molestation and first-degree rape. The gap between the crime and the state conviction was approximately 30 years. On February 20, 2020, a federal judge sentenced Henri Piette in Oklahoma City. The sentence handed down was life in prison for the kidnapping conviction and 360 months, 30 years, for the conviction of traveling with intent to engage in sexual acts with a juvenile. Piette was also ordered to pay a $50,000 fine and $50,067 in restitution directly to Rosalynn McGinnis. The federal sentence carries no possibility of parole. Rosalynn McGinnis spoke to 41 Action News after the sentencing. She said she felt relief. After 19 years of captivity, after walking herself to a consulate gate with 8 children, after going public with her name, after testifying in federal court, she used the word relief. Not victory. Not closure. Relief. That word alone tells you everything about what the preceding years had cost her. In a separate statement, McGinnis said, "When you take a child and you beat them, drug them, and sexually molest them and keep them away from people, it'll break you down." She said it plainly, without theatrics, as a statement of fact about what had been done to her and what she had survived. Following the federal conviction in 2019, McGinnis had told KHB, "I'm just so happy that he is put away where he can't hurt anyone anymore." That was the metric she used. Not justice in the abstract. Not a philosophical reckoning. The concrete, specific relief of knowing he could not reach another child. U.S. Attorney Brian J. Kuster stated at sentencing, "Life in prison is a sentence the law reserves for the most serious offenders, offenders like Henri Piette. For 20 years he inflicted extreme physical and emotional abuse on the victim and her children. For 20 years she feared for her and her children's lives." In August 2022, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals reversed the federal kidnapping conviction on a technical burden of proof error in the jury instructions, while upholding the 30-year conviction for traveling with intent to engage in sexual acts with a juvenile. The life sentence was voided. The 30-year federal sentence remained. Piette was then transferred to face the pending state charges in Wagner County. In October 2024, the Wagner County jury found Piette guilty of rape and lewd molestation and recommended life in prison for the rape charge and 20 years for the molestation charge. The formal state sentencing was scheduled for December 9, 2024. The outcome of that hearing is not confirmed in available sources at the time of this writing. What is confirmed is this: Henri Piette, who was in his early 40s when he put a 12-year-old girl in a van in Poteau, Oklahoma, is now in his late 60s and has been convicted in both federal and state court. He is serving a federal sentence. He faces a state sentence. He will die in prison. Henri Piette was not a registered sex offender at the time he kidnapped Rosalynn McGinnis in January 1997. He was not on parole. He was not under active supervision by any agency. He was a man who had been committing crimes against an 11-year-old girl inside Wagner County, Oklahoma, crimes that the Wagner County State Court would not prosecute him for until 2024, 30 years after they occurred, and who had never been charged, never been convicted, and never been entered into any system that might have flagged him as a danger before the kidnapping. The first systemic failure in this case did not happen in 1997. It happened in the years before 1997, when the abuse of a child inside a private home went undetected and unreported by every institution that existed to prevent exactly that. The second failure happened in January 1997, when Piette crossed the Oklahoma state line with a kidnapped child, and the documented public record shows no sustained pursuit by any named agency in the weeks and months that followed. The case had a name. It had a suspect. It had a missing persons flyer circulated by Child Search Ministries within a short time of the disappearance. And yet no confirmed investigative action in the public record placed a named law enforcement officer within reaching distance of Rosalynn McGinnis at any point in the following 19 years. The third failure was structural and ongoing. Piette moved McGinnis across American states for years before crossing into Mexico. Federal jurisdiction attached to this case the moment he crossed the state line with a kidnapped child. The FBI had the mandate and the resources to pursue an interstate kidnapping. The confirmed public record contains no documented evidence that they did so in any sustained way. Rosalynn McGinnis's missing persons poster sat indexed on the public internet for the entire 19 years she was missing, findable by anyone, including any law enforcement officer who might have searched her name. None did in any confirmed documented account, until after she had already saved herself. There was no lawsuit documented in the public record. There was no settlement. There was no institutional accounting. No named agency that stood before a court and acknowledged that a child had been missing for 19 years while her flyer sat on the internet and no one looked. What there was, instead, was a woman who survived everything that was done to her, carried herself to the door of a government building, and handed 19 years of testimony to the first official who agreed to write it down. The system did not save Rosalynn McGinnis. She saved herself. And then she gave the system the evidence it needed to do the one thing it could still do: put the man who took her in a room he would never leave. Robert Lowery, Vice President for Missing Children at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, said of Rosalynn McGinnis after her escape that what she had demonstrated was uncommon courage. That it took, in his words, a lot of bravery. That statement came from a man who had spent his professional life working with missing children cases. He was not speaking in generalities. He was speaking about a specific woman who had done a specific thing that most people in her position never got the chance to do. Rosalynn McGinnis has not published a memoir. She has not founded an organization in her own name. What she has done is something that required no institution and no publisher and no platform beyond her own willingness to be seen. She went public. In 2017, while Henri Piette was still awaiting trial, she gave her name to People magazine and told the world what had been done to her. She appeared on the Dr. Oz show in 2019 and described, in precise and unflinching language, the psychological machinery of what 19 years of captivity does to a human being. She testified in federal court under oath with her name attached. She cooperated with state prosecutors in Wagner County and testified again. She did all of this while raising 9 children in the Kansas City area, rebuilding a life that had been stolen from her before she was old enough to understand what a life was supposed to look like. Since her return to the United States, McGinnis has worked with the JYC Foundation, the organization founded by J.C. Dugard, another survivor of long-term childhood abduction, whose mission is to provide multidisciplinary support to survivors of prolonged captivity and their families. The foundation fills the gap that ordinary systems leave entirely unaddressed. Not the crisis of escape, but the years of reconstruction that follow it. The therapy. The identity. The task of explaining to 9 children what their lives have been and helping them build something different. McGinnis found in J.C. Dugard not a therapist or a caseworker but someone who already knew, without being told, what the specific texture of that particular kind of survival felt like. Rosalynn McGinnis turned the 19 years that were taken from her into something that could help others. A choice no one had the right to demand of her and no one could make for her. But one she chose to make. In this case, Henri Piette sexually abused Rosalynn McGinnis beginning when she was approximately 10 or 11 years old, inside Waggoner County, Oklahoma, before he ever committed the act the world would eventually know him for. Those crimes happened inside a private home, in a family structure, perpetrated by a man who had positioned himself as a parental figure. They went undetected. They went unreported. They went unprosecuted for 30 years, until a Waggoner County jury finally convicted him of those exact crimes in October 2024. The kidnapping in January 1997 was not the beginning of what Piette did to Rosalynn McGinnis. It was his method of escaping accountability for what he had already done. This matters beyond this one case because it is not rare. Children are most frequently abused by people they know, inside homes, by adults who have established trust with the family. The gap this case exposes is not a gap in the law. Oklahoma had laws against what Piette did. The gap is in detection, in the willingness of communities, schools, neighbors, and family networks to recognize the signs of abuse inside a domestic structure and report them before a perpetrator has the chance to run. What needs to change is not a statute. It is the cultural assumption that what happens inside a family is a private matter. Rosalynn McGinnis was 11 years old. She was not a private matter. When Henri Piette crossed the Oklahoma state line with Rosalynn McGinnis in January 1997, the case became a federal matter. The FBI carries jurisdiction over interstate kidnapping. The confirmed public record contains no documented evidence of a sustained federal pursuit of Henri Piette across the 19 years he moved Rosalynn through American states and into Mexico. Her missing persons flyer was on the public internet the entire time. His name was on that flyer. The case did not go cold because the evidence disappeared. It went cold, in any documented public sense, because no named agency appears to have looked consistently and persistently in the right places. This matters beyond this one case because Rosalynn McGinnis was not the only missing child in America in 1997. She was one of thousands. And the question her case forces into the open is a structural one. What happens to a federal kidnapping investigation when the trail crosses a border? When the family has no political connections and no media machinery keeping the case alive? When the missing person is a child from a small town in eastern Oklahoma and the suspected perpetrator is a transient with no fixed address? The answer in this case is documented silence. What needs to change is a mandatory, named, accountable investigative protocol for every interstate child abduction. One that does not allow a case to go 19 years without a confirmed documented action by a named agent in the public record. Rosalynn McGinnis's flyer was searchable from any computer in the world. That is not a resource failure. That is a will failure. In 2016, a woman named Lisa met Rosalynn McGinnis at a grocery store in rural Mexico. She was not a federal agent. She was not a forensic investigator. She had no badge, no warrant, and no training in missing persons identification. What she had was the willingness to listen to what Rosalynn was telling her, and the presence of mind to go home and type a name into a search engine. That search took seconds. What it found had been sitting on the public internet for 19 years. This is the lesson that belongs to every person watching this video right now, not as an abstraction but as a direct and practical reality. Missing persons posters exist. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children maintains a database at missingkids.org that is free and publicly accessible. The faces on that database belong to real people who are, right now, somewhere in the world, waiting for someone to recognize them. You do not need a badge to look at a face and feel something is wrong. You do not need a warrant to type a name into a search engine. You do not need training to listen to someone who is trying, in whatever careful and frightened way they can manage, to tell you the truth about their life. Lisa listened. She searched. She helped. 19 years of institutional silence ended because one ordinary person decided that what she had heard at a grocery store mattered enough to act on. You are capable of exactly the same thing. If you've watched this far, leave a comment and let us know where you're watching from.